Take Back Your Health Now, Episode 49.
You're listening to the Take Back Your Health Now podcast, the show that interviews the top doctors, athletes, trainers, and entrepreneurs to help you find the holy grail of health. Now here's your host, Dr. Dan Margolin.
This is Dan Margolin with another segment of Take Back Your Health Now, where we pull out all the stops in search of health's holy grail. We have Julie Rehmeyer on the show today. She's an award-winning mathematics and science writer. She's a contributing editor to Discover magazine and has been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wired, Slate, Science News, and more. Her stories have been featured on the History Channel and NPR's All Things Considered. She's the 2016 recipient of Ted Scripps Environmental Journalism Fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder, and the Excellence in Statistical Reporting Award. She lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Julie, thanks so much for being on the show. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Really glad to join you.
We're really excited to have you. So, Julie, give us a little bit about your journey. One of the things that you were, I guess, diagnosed with was chronic fatigue syndrome. Tell us about that. How did you get diagnosed? What bring us back to the beginning?
Sure. So I first started getting sick quite a while ago, around 1999, and early on it was a gradual onset. I just didn't have the energy I used to have. The more alarming thing in retrospect was that I had problems with exercise, and that actually is really the hallmark symptom of chronic fatigue syndrome. When I exercised, it made me feel worse. And the following day, I hurt, I had much less energy. And that is a lot more disturbing than just the low energy. For quite a few years, go ahead.
Yeah, when you say exercise, like you're talking about weightlifting or running, or what kind of exercise were you doing that it actually made you feel worse, or was it just any exercise? Running,
hiking, but it's also true that pretty much anything, any extensive exercise made me feel worse.
Wow. Well, when I work out, right, I definitely get beat up. I feel tired, but there's a refreshingness that you feel, right, even if it hurts a little. So that you weren't getting that, I guess.
I was not getting that. And I really loved exercise. I mean, I had run a marathon. I was on a search and rescue team, finding lost hikers in the wilderness. I built my own house. I was quite a physical person.
Wow.
And the feeling that I had was like I couldn't downshift, that feeling when you're exercising of like time to push. There was no push there available. It felt like
I'm getting the feeling like the gas tank is empty kind of thing.
There's just nothing there. The gas tank is empty. And then again, afterward, instead of feeling tired, but also kind of energized and refreshed, I just felt lousy. And particularly the next day, I felt lousy. And that was really bizarre for me. And, my response to it was to say, okay, somehow I must have gotten out of shape. So I'll just start at a lower level and I'll build up slowly. And so I, cut way down, and then I had to cut way down again. And I found that I just didn't get better. I could exercise, but it continued to feel lousy. And I didn't get stronger. I didn't get faster. I didn't come to feel better.
How old were you when this was diagnosed?
When it was, it wasn't diagnosed until 2006.
Okay.
So at that point I was 34. But I first started getting sick 7 years earlier. So it was, late 20s when it first started coming on.
So this is a long runway in coming. So you're starting to feel like there's something not right. Are you compensating for this by drinking a lot of coffee or drinking a lot of tea, or how does that work?
No, I didn't really do that. I was, at the time I started getting sick, I was building my house and I was working extremely, extremely hard. And I figured, okay, I just am overdoing it and I need to finish the house. I need to get my house in order. I need to lower the stress in my life and I'll be okay. And I did feel somewhat better after finishing the house and getting my life in order, but not dramatically so. And I focused on self-care. So my responses were pretty healthy. I focused on eating well and getting enough rest and and thought that my body would bounce back, and it just didn't really.
It really didn't. And what was your diet like at that time? Were you eating pretty well?
I was eating pretty well, yeah. It's different from how I would eat now. I was more in the low-fat mode. Not dramatically so, but that was kind of my level of awareness at the time.
Okay.
But I ate a lot of vegetables and reasonable amount of meat and, pretty decent healthy diet.
And then just take us, so now at a certain point, I guess it gets to like that extreme point where you said, listen, there's something here. Did you start going to different doctors, or how did you start this?
Over the course of 2006, things started getting a little more alarming. The problems with exercise were getting more extreme. The next day I would literally barely be able to walk, and I'd be in a huge amount of pain. And there was a week that when I just was so exhausted I could barely get out of bed, and I kind of figured it was just some strange flu, but it was pretty weird because I didn't have any other flu symptoms, and it was getting harder to manage and maintain my full life. So I was getting more and more concerned, and then one morning I woke up and I couldn't walk.
Oh, wow.
It was very dramatic. I mean, I could kind of stagger, but I was almost bent double. Each step was this huge act of will. And it was terrifying. And of course, I figured, oh my gosh, I must have, multiple sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease or some terrible neurodegenerative disease like that. And so I went to a neurologist, and the neurologist did a fairly cursory exam, and then he diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome. And my reaction was, fatigue? I'm not tired. I can't walk. Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And so then I was like, okay, so then what kind of, treatments or tests or other doctors, like, what do I do next? And he had nothing to offer. And
wait, Julie, let me ask. So he diagnosed, was there a test that diagnosed it, or he just looked at you?
Nope. There were no tests, no nothing.
So I got to imagine, just from your viewpoint, that doesn't give you a lot of confidence.
No,
right?
It definitely did not give me a lot of confidence.
You're right. Oh my God. Are you in pain when you're walking, or it's just literally you just trying to drag your legs? Like, describe that for us.
Yeah, it was painful, but it was kind of painful the way that weightlifting is painful. Okay. It wasn't like stabbing pains or something like that. It was just that it was such an enormous effort. The feeling that I had was like both my legs weighed, 300 pounds apiece, and like the nerve signals were getting scrambled on the way down. The image that came to my mind was like somebody had replaced my legs with those of an elephant and done a sloppy job and only connected 10% of the nerves.
I totally got that visual. Wow. That's terrible. That is like horrible. Oh my God.
Yeah, it was pretty terrible. And it was so shocking to, go to a neurologist and get this diagnosis that for him clearly meant, please get out of my office. I have nothing to offer you.
Right. So when you do get out of his office, you're obviously going to start looking on your own. You start.
Absolutely.
What do you start doing? Hitting the internet?
Exactly. I went and the next stop was to Dr. Google. And so I learned, a little bit about the disease, although at that point, especially, really the information online about chronic fatigue syndrome was very poor. I found one chronic fatigue syndrome specialist in the entire San Francisco Bay Area, which struck me as bizarre. I went to see him, and he didn't have any overall grand overarching theory about the disease, but he had a kind of bag of tricks that seemed fairly promising. So it was a sort of functional medicine approach, and he did things like, he gave me supplements to support mitochondrial function and to improve gut flora and, a whole, to treat some minor vitamin deficiencies and a kind of big array of approaches.
But Julie, you're walking around with legs that feel like an elephant.
Exactly.
I mean, that's like, this is not the time to like get a small vitamin and say
exactly. And
right?
that was my reaction. I mean, he struck me as like half reasonable and half a quack.
Right, sure.
And certainly nothing that he did seemed at all kind of adequate for the problem at hand. And in fact, none of it made very much of a difference in the end. And I had no experience with alternative medicine in any form. I was extremely uncomfortable with all of this.
But let me ask you, you're a mathematician basically and a science writer. So
Exactly.
what is your background? Go over that a little bit.
You're
coming to this from a scientific approach, I imagine.
Absolutely. Yes. So I'm an MIT trained mathematician, and then I became a science writer. I've written about all kinds of different science topics. So the next thing I did was to read through the scientific literature to try to make sense of it myself and figure out what was going on. And that too was pretty appalling because I rapidly realized that the science really sucked. The studies were small, they hadn't been replicated, and they were all over the map. I mean, there were abnormalities in practically every system of the body that had been found. But reading through the studies, I didn't know which of those findings were solid. And in any case, what did they all add up to? What was the key something in the midst of that kind of array of findings? It was really hard.
Was there one consistent thing that sort of wove its way through all of those different studies?
Nope. There was really nothing that stood out as being very impressive. So it was just appalling for me. It felt like, okay, medicine has nothing to offer, science has nothing to offer, so I'm on my own here.
Wow.
So I made a discovery that I think most chronic fatigue syndrome patients make eventually. I woke up one day feeling better and thought, great, I'm going to go get some groceries. And so I went to the grocery store, and by the time I got to my car, I could barely lift the bags into the car.
Wow.
I drove home, and like at dinner, I got to the point where I couldn't lift the spoon to my mouth. And that night I woke up in the middle of the night and had to pee, and I took 2 steps and just could not move at all.
I was
just
God.
Stuck. And so as horrifying as that was, it ended up being kind of a key moment for me because I realized that I'd overdone it in going to the grocery store and that had made everything much worse. And so at that point, I kind of started a program for myself of aggressive rest. And I found that it made a really big difference. Are
you naturally like a type A personality, or are you somebody that can
I'm pretty driven.
kick back a little bit?
I'm pretty driven. I mean, I'm not like endlessly driven, but I'm definitely a pretty ambitious, driven,
So even that's got to be a little bit tough for you, though. That's even
yeah,
that common, right?
It was a challenge for me, but it paid off so clearly that made it easier to stick with. And what I found over time, I was able to then get somewhat more active. I could even exercise a little bit. What I learned was the very moment the thought sort of drifted through my mind, I'm a little tired, I had to stop right then. If I kept going 2 more minutes, then I paid. But if I noticed that very first signal that my energy was dropping and stopped and took care of myself immediately, then, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, I was okay. And
Julie,
so
when you say stopped and took care of yourself, you're talking about just go to bed.
Yeah, just rest.
Okay.
Yeah, rest. So, if I was out walking, then it was time to sit down, preferably lie down.
Yep. Wow.
So I figured that out in early 2007, and that ended up being the key for me for managing things for about 4 years.
Oh my goodness.
And there was a lot of variability. I had bad periods when I had to be in bed a lot. And then I had good periods when I could actually do quite a bit. And I also there were a lot of strange things. I mean, I could be walking down the street feeling fine and then suddenly notice that my leg was dragging and then within another block be stuck as a mouse in a glue trap, unable to move. And
Oh my God! Well, how scary is that? Because I'm assuming you're going out in public. You're like,
right.
right? I mean, like, wow.
You adapt. You just sort of learn. I mean, I learned that when you ask strangers for help and you're very explicit about what you need them to do, and it's a manageable thing for them to do, typically they are delighted to be helpful.
Right.
So,
Okay.
So I learned that, when I needed help, I just asked for it. And most of the time it worked out fine.
Okay, great. Well, gives me faith in my fellow human beings again.
Yep.
Great.
So, it was sort of a strange way to live, but it was more or less manageable. And then in late 2010, I was in a really good period. I was able, as I say, to do some hikes, like, fairly mellow 3-mile hikes, that kind of thing. And I was on one such hike and heading home about a mile from home, and I thought, I'm a little tired. And so I stopped. I stopped and I rested, and then I had to keep walking because I had to get home. And I knew that I would pay for it, and I figured, it would be a day or 2 or maybe 3 in bed, in pain,
Oh my God, you really paid for this.
Well, I paid a lot worse than that. It turned out to be a year.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I spent a year bedbound about half the time, and by the end of that year, I was living alone, really barely able to take care of myself, at times unable to turn over in bed. I'd gone at that point, when I got that sick, then I was like, okay, I have to find a doctor who can help me. And so I went off to the top chronic fatigue syndrome specialists. And they were wonderful. And they had some treatments that helped for a while, but ultimately nothing they had made a difference.
I mean, what were some of the treatments? Give us like what
the most, the one that had the biggest effect is this is almost incredible. It was Gatorade. Gatorade was a miracle for me for a while. And the reason for that is that chronic fatigue syndrome patients typically have about 1 liter less blood than healthy people do. And the result is that when we stand up, our bodies can't get blood up to the brain. And so what happens is that our blood pressure drops and our heart rate climbs. And if we drink electrolytes, then that increases blood volume. And that ameliorates those symptoms. So for a while, that was really, really helpful for me, simple as it is. And in fact, like there were times when I was out in public and could feel myself fading and didn't have any electrolytes with me. And so I would literally just take the salt shaker on the table and pour a little mountain of salt into my hand and toss it down my throat and drink a glass of water. and it would bring me back from the dead. So that was great for a while.
Beneficial. Sure.
Yeah.
Julie, let me ask you, do you have close relatives with you at this point? Like, how was your...
No, that was part of what was really terrifying. At that point, I had little family to turn to. I was living by myself. I was running out of money, barely able to work. And it was terrifying. And, we don't have, like in this country, we don't have much of a social safety net. And about the only future I could see for myself was like in a Medicaid funded nursing home. I was 39. It was completely terrifying.
Sure. I'm so sorry you went through that.
So then a kind of amazing thing happened. I managed to write a magazine story for Slate, the online magazine Slate, about chronic fatigue syndrome. And that was the first time that I publicly kind of came out as having this disease. And as a result of that, I got contacted by other patients on Facebook. I got a sort of stream of friend requests on Facebook. And I accepted them all, seemed like the friendly thing to do. And a group of these patients called themselves moldies. They believed that having taken extreme measures to avoid mold had brought them huge health benefits. And my first reaction to this was, I thought, oh, what a bunch of hooey. I was just completely skeptical. I mean, what I knew about mold was mold could cause allergies or asthma or, a few other respiratory problems, but it couldn't cause paralysis. That just seemed like way beyond anything that the science showed.
Right.
At the same time, I was reading their stories, and there was one young man who had spent 2 months living in a cargo trailer in the desert, and he posted pictures of himself running through the wilderness and lifting weights. And I was lying there in bed, and I missed exercise so much, of course, along with like having a life. And it just blew my mind, and was very hard to kind of ignore, even though I was pretty convinced this was a bunch of stupidity. So I thought, well, what the heck? I'll just talk to these people, even if they're a bunch of crazies, no harm in asking them a few questions. And they told me, many things, but their recommendation was that I go to the desert for 2 weeks with none of my own belongings. And that if I did so, my body would get clear of mold. And that when I then came home, I would react really strongly and clearly to my own stuff and where I was living. So this was kind of intriguing to me because, it's an experiment, right? Like,
sure.
It's, science in action.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're part of the experiment, but absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was doing just a little bit better then. So I thought there was a reasonable chance I would be able to pull it off. I was not certain. I mean, the idea of being paralyzed and alone in the desert was quite scary, but I thought there was a good chance I could pull it off. And so I decided to try it. And I spent 2 weeks in Death Valley, just me and my dog, out in the middle of nowhere and in Death Valley. And then,
my God, you've got guts, Julie. I got to tell you, man, I'm like blown away.
It was quite an experience. It was.
And when you said you're in Death Valley, you're camping. You got tents, or you're renting a bungalow, or what are you doing?
No, I was camping. Yeah, I borrowed camping equipment from friends since I wasn't allowed to take my own. And I was, just up a Jeep trail.
Had you ever done anything like that before? Had you ever?
Yeah, I had camped, and I was pretty outdoorsy, so that aspect of it wasn't unfamiliar. So at the end of, let's see, I spent 2 weeks in Death Valley, and I felt a little bit better while I was there, but, there was so much variation in how I felt day to day and week to week anyway that I was not so impressed by that improvement. The real test was when I got home. I just had to hope that I would get home and I'd get really, really sick.
Yeah, right.
And so I went home, and indeed 30 seconds in my own home, and I was crippled afterward.
Oh, come on.
Yep. It was really, really impressive. And then I did a whole bunch of tests afterwards and found it was just completely clear. I mean, like, literally just handling some papers from my house was enough to cripple me. Like, sitting in my car. So you're saying that
there was such a high level of mold in your house that it was actually created? Is that what was going on?
Well, actually, probably not. What happens is, once you've gotten sickened by mold, you get far more susceptible to it. So actually, quite tiny exposures can have devastating impacts once you've gotten sickened by it in the first place.
Wow. Okay.
So, it's not, I mean, I think, so I was actually living in a pair of travel trailers at that point. I had originally lived in them while I was building my house, and then moved back into them when I was poor and needed to save money. So basically all old travel trailers are somewhat moldy. And probably the trailers played a significant role in kicking off the illness in the first place. But I also, in general, I would say chronic fatigue syndrome tends to be a kind of multifactorial illness with many triggers combining. So in my case, clearly mold was really central, but at the same time, it was also probably relevant that I was under a huge amount of emotional and physical stress at that time when I was building my house, and I was married and my husband was quite ill, and it was just all around an extraordinarily trying time. And so,
Julie, when you just going back, when you say building your house, you mean physically building your house, right?
That's right. I built it myself.
Wow, that's because when people say I'm building a house, it means I got a contractor.
No. This
you're
was
talking about actually.
yeah.
Okay, that's
right.
a totally different.
I may well have had some toxic exposures during the construction of the house. I mean, I used relatively low toxicity materials, but nevertheless, that seems like that may well have been a contributor. For many, many people, viruses play a role. Viruses also played a role for me, though I didn't have a sudden onset where I got some bug and then never recovered. But I did have reactivated viruses in my body, and viruses were clearly part of the picture. So the point I'm trying to make is just, in general, with chronic fatigue syndrome, there are multiple triggers that add up, and they then combine to break something in the body. And we don't know very well what the key something that breaks is, or some things that break are. Right. But that tends to be the way it goes. So the fact that mold played such a role for me doesn't necessarily mean that mold plays the same role for other chronic fatigue syndrome patients.
I mean, do you find that there's usually like one major factor with chronic fatigue syndrome where, different people, may be mold, it may be a virus, but there's one overriding factor?
We don't really know at this point. We just don't know enough.
And then when you realize that it is mold, that's your main factor, right? How do you react to that? How do you prevent it? How do you...
Well, so when I got back from Death Valley and it was clear that mold was making me sick, then I stayed out of my trailers and away from my stuff. And a week later, I was just sitting outside on my land and found myself feeling pretty good. And so I decided to take my dog for a little walk, figuring I probably wouldn't be able to go very far, but it'd feel good to move around a little bit. I ended up walking to the top of the hill behind my house, 350 feet high. And I took a picture from up there of the whole Rio Grande Valley. I live just outside of Santa Fe, and sent it to all my friends with the subject line, "Oh my God."
Wow.
I was so blown away. I hadn't been able to do that for a year and a half.
Wow. So you really figured this out on your own. I mean, you really were your own doctor in this case.
That's right. And also with the help of the experience of other patients. I mean, other patients were invaluable in this. And that was one of the key lessons for me was patients have an enormous wisdom. And early on, I kind of turned up my nose at other patients. I felt like, they were not sufficiently scientific. They pursued all these crazy theories. They weren't, analytical in thinking about them and that kind of thing. Well, at this point, I've learned, of course they were pursuing unscientific theories because there was no damn science.
Wow. Well, unbelievable. How many people do you think suffer from this?
It's 1 million. The best estimate is 1 million Americans and something like 17 million people worldwide.
Oh, it's big. It's big numbers. What is your advice? If they were listening to you right now, somebody that's potentially suffering from this, what's your advice for them?
Advice number one is pace yourself. Learn not to overdo it. That's the key, particularly early on. Doing that well quickly can make the difference between it being a short-term problem that eventually goes away and being a devastating lifelong illness. So that is absolutely number one. Number two, I'd say, is you're not going to get answers from doctors. You're not going to get answers from science, not at this point. And you may get some help from doctors, but don't expect that they're going to be able to solve the problem for you. You're going to have to take responsibility for your own health. And a key part of that is listening to other patients and sorting through their experiences and thinking about what might or might not apply to you, what you can draw from the experiences of other patients. And you have to be very savvy about that. Of course, you can't just run off after every promising story that you hear, but there is a lot of wisdom in the experience of other patients. And you just have to be really thoughtful about your own experiences and accept the responsibility to find your own way forward.
Julie, what an incredible story. If I were to ask you, what would you consider the holy grail of health to be? What would that be?
I would say kind of what I was just saying. I think it's self-responsibility.
Yeah. It's the name of our show, Take Back Your Health Now. I mean,
Exactly.
It is really putting the responsibility back on the patients to just start to study. And like you said, you're really an example of somebody that took responsibility. And obviously, at some level, you still had a choice. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people that, when faced with the situation, would not have taken the extreme measures you had of going out to camp for 2 weeks and, using yourself as an experiment. But well done on your part.
Thank you very much.
Julie, how would people that want to get in touch with you, maybe have similar situations, how would they find out more about you? How would they get in touch with you?
The best thing would be to go to my website for my book. So I have a book coming out that's called Through the Shadowlands, A Science Writer's Odyssey into an Illness Science Doesn't Understand. It's coming out on May 23rd, and there's a website for the book, throughtheshadowlands.com.
Throughtheshadowlands.com. Love it. What a great title.
Thank you.
Julie, I want to thank you for being on the show. I'm sure you're going to help a lot of people with your message, and I know with your book, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you.
This episode is sponsored by New Jersey Foot and Ankle Center in Oradell, New Jersey. Remember, when you have a foot problem, you've got a foot doctor in the family. Weekend and evening appointments are available. Call us at 201-261-9445. Once again, that's 201-261-9445. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes over at drdanspeaks.com. If you're loving the show, head over to iTunes and leave us a review, and we'll catch you next time.